But having said that, everyone, hello and welcome to the Arizona Faith Network Smart Justice Cafe. We are completely honored to have Julie Gunnigle with us today. She is a candidate for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. My name is Billy Fidlin, and I am president of the Arizona Faith Network's Board of Directors. I am the Director of Outreach and Justice for the Desert Southwest Conference United Methodist Church, president of the Board of Arizona Faith Network, as well as founder and president of Whisper and Thunder, which is a Native American nonprofit. But today we're here to talk with Julie about her candidacy and all things related to it. I would like to let our viewers know that while we're here live, if you do have questions, please post them in the chat area and we'll be happy to get to them as we can. With me today is Khalil Rashdan, and he is on our board of directors. Also, David Topping is our tech advisor on this video shoot. And then of course we have our candidate, Julie Gunnigle. I'd like to open with a theological framing from Arizona Faith Network. The faith traditions affirm the basic dignity and worth of each human individual and call for reform of a legal system that results in mass incarceration of persons in the United States. All of our faiths tell us that God, as understood in each of the traditions, is concerned with the well-being of all persons, regardless of gender, race, ability, and/or economic standing, and that higher power is merciful and forgiving. Our combined scriptures speak of God as one who seeks to restore relationship and community, one who is merciful and punishes to bring transformation and renewal, not out of revenge. And so we understand that our own moral imperative is to be imitation of these characteristics of the holy, of the divine. The Arizona Faith Network sees itself as a bridging agent. We are a safe place where people who may or may not agree can come together and hold peaceful dialogue with each other. And so with that, I welcome you to today's Smart Justice Cafe. To the conversation, I bring in Khalil.
Thank you, Billy. So my name is Khalil Rashdan. I'm one of the board members for Arizona Faith Network. I'm also an advocate in the community. I've worked criminal justice reform for a while. And the biggest thing is I'm someone directly impacted by incarceration. So these issues that we address today are of serious concern, not only to help identify the problems, but also to identify effective solutions that we can bring to the table. With that being said, the only way that we can change this punitive culture here is to come together, have serious conversations, but then also when it's time to put the work in and start to implement these solutions, we need all hands on deck. So the cafe today, and I will go brief, give a brief description. The cafe is the greatest opportunity to center the leadership of those directly impacted. An impacted person, family member, community member, it provides a platform for them to tell their stories, to engage, to be part of the process, and to, like I said earlier, to go beyond, to help implement solutions. But the biggest part of it, it starts to break down barriers. And it invites truth, because the foundation that we have to build on has to be a foundation laid on truth and not a foundation laid on falsities. The community that we address not only go beyond those directly impacted, but when we talk about that definition of second chance and what does it mean, I always talk about in these workshops and cafes, second chance definition is not only applied to the person who is incarcerated or who is released. Second chance opportunity is also for the community. It's a second chance to create a pathway to forgiveness, to create a pathway to love, to mercy, compassion. Because one of the biggest barriers in criminal legal system that has to change is this culture to just punish people. Instead of investing in restorative healing. So that's the two things that we need to think about today. One, punishment, punitive culture. The other, restorative healing, and how we can help the community come together to participate in this. So it's an honor to be here today. We'll talk about some next steps at the end. And then also, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box and we will get to those questions. And I think that's about it, Billy.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Julie, we're going to turn it over to you. And just in the beginning, just tell us a little bit about you. Just what would you like people to know, not only about your background, but just about you? What do we need to know?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. You know, just a little bit about me. I was born and raised right here in Maricopa County. I was, an intensive care baby at John C. Lincoln Hospital that nobody thought was going to make it. I spent my first moments on earth struggling to breathe. I am the daughter of a public school teacher. My parents raised me with values very much centered about the community and about what it means to be in public service. My path, though, went a different direction than both of my parents. I went to NAU and got a degree in chemistry, and then later went to the University of Notre Dame Law School to get my law degree and ended up serving the public as a prosecutor in Indiana. There I focused on violent crimes and child-on-child sexual assault, and was later tapped to join the Cook County Financial Crime and Public Corruption Bureau, where it was my honor to hold elected officials accountable when they were stealing public funds. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I am running right now, whether it be on a state or a national level. I'm frustrated with the conflicts of interest in our government. I think it's one of the reasons why we continue to see a culture of mass incarceration here, that folks are taking contributions from our private prison industry that profits on human suffering and going ahead and raising things like mandatory minimums that drive our most marginalized people into incarceral systems for the rest of their lives. And in my view, that's wrong. And I want to refocus our county attorney's office to a place that does justice, that looks at the needs of the entire community, that's able to build coalitions and work toward unity, and is a place where people can count on that when a case is brought to them, that it's going to be handled in a way, and I love the way that you put it, that's not focused on this retributive, punitive system, but it is instead focused on the needs of the entire community and is focused on promoting healing. And the county attorney is the place to do it. So in our county, our county is actually the 4th largest county in the country. It has the 3rd largest prosecutor's office in the entire country, which should beg the question, why have we not been a national leader when it comes to criminal justice reform? And there's a long legacy that I'm seeking to end, and that my candidacy is seeking to end, of 40 years of single party control, but also a legacy of folks like Sheriff Joe, who still loom large in this office, and Andrew Thomas and Bill Montgomery, that built Arizona to be the 5th largest incarcerator in the country and the 8th largest in the world. So I'm looking at this office with the ideas of hope and change and justice. And we're just a mere 22 days away from a historic election where we could make those big changes.
Well, thank you. That's a great opening to our conversation. I appreciate it. I should let you know I moved here from South Bend.
So, really?
Yes. Yeah, I did. And where I worked with gang members in the Measle Elementary School District area, and did that for many years, both there and here. And then also, so as I pose these questions today, I want you to know that I come from that lens of working with gang members and seeing their potential, their unharnessed potential. And also I teach leadership at Perryville Women's Prison when we can. And so having said that, I want to first open up our dialogue around police accountability. There are several campaigns occurring calling for transformative policing reforms in light of the recent killing of George Floyd Breonna Taylor, and Deion Johnson. We could name more. Are these calls for police reform, do they have legitimate concerns in your opinion?
100%. I mean, it's absolutely undeniable that our criminal justice system treats Black, Indigenous, and people of color differently at every stage, and that in their interactions with police, they're disproportionately likely to be targeted with violence. The data shows that. It's undeniable. I think the bigger question is, what do we do about it?
Mm-hmm. You know, you'll notice in the chat, Julie, if you have that open, it says it's Indigenous Peoples Day. What are the special challenges for these communities and how might we address them? So certainly Native Americans in our area, but whomever else, what do you see as those special challenges, and especially in light of police accountability?
Yeah, okay, so let me go to police accountability writ large, and I want to circle back because that is just so important on Indigenous Peoples Day. Here's what we should be thinking about when it comes to police accountability. You know, I have joined the call of so many who've been asking for an independent unit for police use of force at our county attorney's office. Let me break that down a little bit, why that matters so much. You know, as prosecutors, you work day in and day out alongside officers, and that's the way it has to be because that's the way that cases arrive at that office. But it promotes some really cozy relationships, up to and including prosecutors even being married to the officers that they meet in these interactions. And to me, when we talk about issues of good governance and conflict of interest, it's absolutely a conflict of interest to ask those same prosecutors to hold police accountable when there's unauthorized use of force cases. So I'm calling for independence. To me, that means someone who's not a line prosecutor working with those same officers day in and day out. I'm also calling for a transparent process because, you know, due process needs to be transparent. Right now, these cases are being referred to the Critical Incident Review Team, which is a team of 4 people that the county attorney won't even release their names. And in my view, that's also not good governance. You know, it's not okay to have citizens who are making decisions in these very important cases, and we don't even know a baseline of who they are. And incidentally, it doesn't have to be this way. When Phoenix moved toward their civilian review board, they released the names and the meeting times of all of their members and provided that real transparent process. So when I have joined this call to be, you know, an independent unit, it also needs to be community involved. In my view, what that means is having community members such that everybody can trust that when a case arrives at this office, that all parties involved are being treated transparently. When it comes to Indigenous Peoples Day, first of all, it's amazing that we're celebrating that today, and I know that is due to the efforts of an amazing senator from LD12. Senator Peschel, thank you so much. We need to make this permanent in Arizona. It's a one-time only celebration the way it's listed into law right now. But when it comes to how this office interacts with Indigenous people, I mean, we know that Indigenous people are more likely to be targeted with instances of unauthorized use of force. We know that they're more likely to be targeted for convictions writ large and for arrests. And we know that when they are victimized, they're least likely to have their cases taken up by the county attorney. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that we needed to have a full-scale investigation into the disappearances of Indigenous women. And I know that Jennifer Germain has been so instrumental in creating that commission. I can't wait to work with them, you know, even more closely, because pursuing justice means getting it right, you know, when we are charging folks, but it also means who we're pursuing justice on behalf of. And it's a big justice gap right now that, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are treated differently on that end.
Yeah, in terms of the MMIWG, so women and girls, I think we're like 6th in the nation in terms of that. And so it's a huge issue. And there's a lot of victimization at a lot of different levels. There's the crime itself, and then there's also, you know, what may or may not happen with the police force. And so, and you've kind of addressed this, you talked about transparency, but, you know, there's this mistrust that exists between certain peoples and the officers, the police department, law in general. How would you how would you address the mistrust? I mean, you can say, yes, we're going to have a transparent office now. Yes, this is our policy and so forth. But it's going to take a long time for people to grasp onto that and say, okay, I believe you. What do you have, you know, a key for to unlock and to try and get through to people and say, wait, this is different, and it would be time for us to start anew? What would you do?
Listen, there's no magic to it. Those who are distrustful are right to be distrustful, and I think we need to start by acknowledging that. I would note that just acknowledging that would be such a big step in this office. You know, we were asked at the beginning of this run for office, you know, does systemic racism exist in our system? And my answer is, of course, yes, it absolutely does. And here's the path to addressing it. Our current administration instead said that they would discipline anyone who inappropriately uses race to make decisions. And in my view, that's not even the first step. The first step is acknowledging that we have a problem, because you can't even begin to build trust until you acknowledge that the distrust is well placed and understand where that's coming from. So when I look at these issues surrounding police reform, it seems to me that we need to have someone in this office who's a unifier, who's willing to build those connections and not just have those conversations. I'm so sick of the word conversations. We talk about things endlessly. We need real action. And what the community is asking for are those basic levels of transparency. And in my view, that just goes beyond what this office has to offer. It also means that in using the advocacy piece of this office, that our county attorney should have come out in favor of body cams, for example, a long time ago, and the prompt release of their footage, but should have come out in favor of so many of the other reforms that folks like Reg Bolding and Diego Rodriguez have been asking for a very long time in their calls.
Thank you. Would you support eliminating qualified immunity for law enforcement?
Absolutely. I think that's a necessary first step toward establishing trust. I would note how it has to be done, though, because qualified immunity is this doctrine that is invented out of whole cloth that came from our federal judiciary. So when it comes to how we eliminate qualified immunity, it very much has to come either from the judiciary or from the federal government. That being said, prosecutors traditionally haven't taken this particular stance and haven't been able to inform Congress as efficiently as they should about why it's so imperative that we take these steps. So yes, totally in favor, don't have the power to do it, but I will be an advocate for eliminating qualified immunity.
How in your office define the community calls for defunding or divesting police departments and utilizing the funds for other community programs for restoration, et cetera?
It's a really good question. So your county attorney does not determine funding toward police departments. And I just want to be very clear on that, because there's attack ads being run left, right, and center on that issue right now. And they just misunderstand what this office does. This office should be holding everyone to incredibly high standards. And I'll note like how profoundly pro-police that is to say that we need everybody to have equal justice under the law, and hold those with a badge who are supposed to be protecting and serving to the highest possible standards. And that's where this office really interacts with police accountability and rebuilding trust.
Would you take a public stand?
Well, I've taken a public stand on 25 Saves Phoenix Lives and the funding for the Civilian Review Board. And I think that's such an important step in Phoenix. You know, Phoenix has known almost untold violence, and was #1 in the nation back in 2019 when it came to police-related shootings. So I was so proud to see that effort first got funded, and then B, is done in a transparent way, again, where we know who the members are of the Civilian Review Board and that there's actual accountability. I think that's a vital first step.
So to tag on with that, you know, once elected, one of you will represent everyone in the community, whether they voted for you or not. It is your job to represent all of us. So in that sense, and you just mentioned this, would you consider actually expanding the community advisory board to grassroots organizations and, you know, people that may not be the obvious select to put on that committee?
Oh my goodness, yes. So first of all, when it comes, and I think there's a few different community boards that are operating out of the county attorney's office right now that merit our attention. But the critical incident review team currently is 4 members, and it has been my criticism from day one that 4 people can't possibly represent the diverse interests of Maricopa County and its residents. So we need to absolutely expand that board. I want to see this office become more involved with directly impacted people. I want to see our prosecutors engaging in that work. I want them to be visiting prisons so that they understand when they're making these recommendations, what it really means to folks on the ground and to families. I want to make sure that all of these voices are heard. And right now I don't hear that happening. And I think that's especially prevalent in the reviews that we've been hearing from the county attorney's office, that it's too much conversation, not listening to people, and then not taking action.
Which is a really good commentary on accountability. And, you know, there's a listening factor, but there's also got to be some process of accountability for your office, et cetera, so that people actually see there's some kind of progress going on. And you know, the transparency factor would help also, you know, even just saying, you know, out loud, these are the time frames, this is how long it's going to take, these are the steps, these are the processes. But there has to be accountability for that office, as all public offices.
Billy, I totally agree with you. And that's actually why it's so frustrating as a member of the public. So let's take one aspect of that office. You know, the ACLU recently sued the county attorney's office to get records pertaining to the racial disparities in policing and prosecution. Both county attorneys, Bill Montgomery and our current unelected county attorney, fought that case. The taxpayers ended up paying $24,000 as a result of the public records suit. And that information was eventually released, showing that Maricopa County has some of the worst racial disparities in sentencing in the country. Now that information got put on a public facing dashboard, and there's some issues with that dashboard. In particular, the #1 crime that comes through our county attorney's office are drugs. And the dashboard lumps all of those drug related offenses together. So you can't really do the deep dive that you need in order to discover which policies are going well and which ones aren't in the county attorney's office that are, you know, replicating these racially based disparities. What frustrates me as a member of the public is now we have a front-facing dashboard. Now we have the data. Now we have absolute proof that, for example, Black folks are 4 times more likely to be convicted of a marijuana offense when we know that all races use marijuana at about the same rate. We don't have any follow-up. We don't have any mechanism. We don't have any way to, as the public, say, what are you going to do to fix this? This is wrong. All we have at our county attorney's website right now is an advertisement of the inequities of our criminal justice system, but no way to fix them. And if I were to put, you know, my finger on exactly what's wrong, it's that right there, that there's no action, there's no follow-up, there's no way for the community to be involved on that front.
Well, and as you were talking, I was thinking back across my experience in Perryville, where I have 50 to 60 women at a time, and how their sentences don't match, how they're, I mean, I could go on ad nauseum, especially about their children who have been left without a mother for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but another day. I'd like to move on to hate crimes on religious communities. Certainly with the Arizona Faith Network, we are in a continual mode of growth. We, you know, have a number of different faiths that are already members of ours. So, you know, certainly Muslims are, you know, represented, Jewish people are represented, Sikhs, you know, we have a number of people, and it's constantly growing. We hear about the hate crimes, even the ones that don't make the news. So with that in mind, with no hate crime legislation on the books of Arizona, she reads shockingly from her question list. How would you address attacks on religious communities, Julie?
Sure, I would, well, a few things. First, we do have an enhancement for hate crime related crime, and it's not often charged, it's not often added. We need to have standalone hate crime legislation, and I will be your biggest ally and advocate for that down at the state capitol, because you're absolutely right. When we saw just, I believe it was 2 years ago, the heinous attacks on mosques, where at that point in time, it was Bill Montgomery, got directly involved with the plea bargaining process for the folks involved in that. That sent a message to the rest of the community that was somehow okay, that it was somehow going to be treated differently than other sorts of crime. And it seems to me that we need to have a loud voice for equity, that it will never be okay to target folks based on religious beliefs or affiliations.
And I think we need to remember the victims, both the victims and the perpetrators, because there's a problem on either side that we need to help. But nobody in this state, in this country, should live in fear on a day-to-day basis because of the religious, practice that they maintain. Now, you just mentioned Muslims. Certainly in the last, few years, both the Muslim community and the Jewish community, they both have been victimized. And we're wondering, have you reached out to those groups? Have you had discussions? Is it your intent to do so? We certainly worry, in the terms of the magnitude, just of the, the few things that we can address in this conversation today, the magnitude of your job. But we definitely have to, try and reach out to folks. So have you done that, or is it your intent to do so?
Yeah, I absolutely have. And I think it's really important. We just, even, last month saw a disgusting anti-Semitic vandalism of the George Washington Carver Museum downtown. And what I didn't hear was any of that outcry. I reached out. I've been continuing conversation with folks like Arizona Jews for Justice and the National Council of Jewish Women. And building those relationships is key. It's got to be across faiths. It's got to be across political lines. Community means all of us. And I think you're really right to point out that this office will serve you whether you vote for me or not.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you. I wanted to jump in. One of the biggest, for me, I've seen the biggest impact this office has made down at the legislature over the years. And, the office, we've had Bill Montgomery go down, and basically kill bills that didn't serve interests to his office. And I have to be careful because in the interest of justice, you would think that there would be some fundamental fairness. But when you have statues like the Hannah Pryor statue, which you're pretty familiar with, where people are pretty much overcharged, there's multiple counts, and then this leads to a person having an excessive sentence. What are some of the things that you see yourself being able to advocate for down at the legislature? And, do you support efforts to end cash bail practices where, people are literally sitting in jail because they don't have the means to bail out? And we've heard this across this country, which has more of an impact on the person. They can lose their jobs, and disrupt family, especially during this pandemic. What legislation do you see yourself supporting? And are there other legislation that we should be aware of that's coming down the pipeline, like, changes to silver forfeiture and things like that?
Yeah, we only have a half an hour, so let me see what I can do. I think that we need to have statutory criminal justice reform. The power and promise of our county attorney's office is that so much of the bad decisions that were made in the past were made as a matter of policy, which means that a reform-minded county attorney, she can change them on day one. So I'm excited to, for example, stop charging Hannah Pryors. Let me, does the audience know what that, can I break that down for a second?
You probably would have to just give a brief explanation.
Sure. Okay, so Hannah Pryors is a particularly unjust, uniquely Arizona issue. wherein someone who is seeing a judge for the very first time can have their sentences enhanced or elevated by virtue of being a repeat criminal offender the first time they see a judge. So it's kind of shocking, and it typically happens in drug-related scenarios where maybe there's multiple buys, where the person is addicted, where after watching those multiple buys, they're arrested, and all of a sudden, that first time they see a judge, they're looking down the barrel at 20 or 25 years as a presumptive sentence. And it's one of the reasons why Arizona is the 8th largest incarcerator in the world. It's one of the reasons why we spend $1.2 billion inside our prison systems, which is more than we spend in our world-class university system, and our community college system, and our public health system combined. So your county attorney can stop charging people in that particular way, because that's an element of prosecutorial discretion. She can stop charge stacking. That's the idea that when you receive a police report, you charge everything in the kitchen sink that you possibly can. She can end the plea to the lead policy that has been so prevalent in this office. In some of these cases, that is the idea that you always have to have someone, when they're taking a plea agreement, plead to the highest possible charge. And she can stop asking for cash bail as a matter of policy. Now, our cash bail system is one that I've taken aim at in this campaign because, again, it's a uniquely American experience to somehow believe that someone's ability to return to court and to not flee the jurisdiction is tied to their ability to pay. And it feeds into this two-tiered system of justice that makes justice very much depend on how much money you make. In Arizona, even just last week, I received reports of someone who was experiencing homelessness, who was being charged for theft of government services, for plugging in his cell phone into a park to make sure that it was charged. And that person was placed behind bars and given a cash bail of 50 or 100 bucks. And someone who's experiencing homelessness isn't able to make that bail and will be held. And irrespective, I mean, I know that everyone on this call is concerned with the morality of that decision, but there's also a very real financial cost. It costs $300 just to book someone into our jail. And incidentally, this is during COVID, where it's nearly impossible to socially distance and protect oneself. So it's quite literally risking death for some of our most marginalized and at-risk Arizonans. And it's also costing us $75 a day. And that's a system that I view as very unjust. Now, we need some statutory promises as well from our legislature in order to totally eliminate cash bail and cash bond. You know, I would also note that jurisdictions all over the country have started to do this because they realize that someone's ability to return to court is in no way related to their financial situation. And I'd also tell you that, guess what? We've also eliminated cash bond in our federal system. We did it in 1986. This is a change that is a long time coming for Arizona. So when we talk about these policy decisions, getting our legislature to codify them, that is to make them permanent so that future county attorneys and county attorneys in the entire state will be doing the same thing and acting in the interests of justice, like that's so important. Also, we need expungement laws. Also, we need sentencing reform. Also, we need to end truth in sentencing. It's been financially devastating and morally devastating to our state. There's one more. What is it? Good time or earned release credits. We need to make sure that we have a fully functional earned release credit system.
And just to add on to that, because, you know, several times, you know, I'm always in the community. You know, I stand on the fact that leadership sets the tone. So just the benefit of the doubt that as county attorney, there may be prosecutors who move forward with the punitive culture. In other words, that's because, I mean, you look at somebody who's plugging their cell phone in and you say, well, you know, this is a common sense issue. But I mean, when someone digs through the facts, a prosecutor digs through the facts and then say, I need to find something in those facts that I want to charge. How do you hold that accountable in such a large office? And then another circumstance too is when we talk about the criminalization of homelessness and how individuals may walk into a Circle K and eat a hot dog and a bag of chips at 11:30, 12 midnight because, all the food, the churches are closed. I think, how do you address that with a large office as a leader?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it'll be one of the toughest challenges when getting into this office. But I think you also have the answer. It's building the community, it's building the village, right? It's knowing that when we talk about the culture in this office, it has to change. That has to be top down, but that also has to be bottom up as well. We need to make sure that we're elevating the voices of prosecutors who know how to do justice, who have those interests of the community in mind, that we're installing supervisors into those roles who are going to empower all of the prosecutors to use their critical thinking. It means also that we're receiving feedback from judges and defense attorneys and from the public defender's office, because you're absolutely right. In an office of just about 1,000 folks, being able to receive that feedback is so key, because you can't be everywhere all of the time. And it seems to me that having some internal controls would be beneficial as well. Right now, this office does not track when it asks for cash bail. There is no way a county attorney can represent to the public or otherwise what is actually happening in these courtrooms, because the attorneys are not receiving the directive not to ask for cash bail. And when they do ask for cash bail, it's not being tracked in any way. So I think being able to track that and keep that data is another measure of transparency that we've been talking about. Is going to be absolutely key to making sure that everybody's on the same page.
Absolutely. And here's a direct question around, would you advocate for the elimination of mandatory minimums? Because as you talked about earlier, I think the legislative intent was to go after big time dealers. However, we're seeing, low level, nonviolent people who have substance use disorders get caught up in the traps of these mandatory minimums. Where there's a lot of people saying we want to move forward based on data. I mean, the data shows who's getting caught up in these mandatory minimums. Would you support or advocate to eliminate these mandatory minimums?
100%.
Okay.
Actually, hang on. I want to tell you why as well, because I think folks have a really interesting view of why mandatory minimums came into being, and I want to disagree actually with you a little bit on it, because I'm not sure that the intent behind mandatory minimums was ever that good intent. So let's talk about real quick an example. So methamphetamine possession here in Arizona has a 5, 10, 15 structure. That means 5 is 5 on the low, presumptive of 10 years, and a max of 15 years. I can't think of an instance where that is ever going to be justified when treatment is more humane and it is less expensive. And it seems to me that those sorts of efforts that were led on this tough on crime, let's punish someone out of substance use disorder, relies on a cynicism and a mythology that I'm just not comfortable with. You can't incarcerate addiction out of a person, nor should we ever try. And when we talk about what our prisons look like right now, we need to acknowledge that rehabilitation is not part of our system in an appreciable way. We have fewer than a couple dozen beds at many of our facilities designated for treatment. Nevertheless, drug crimes are the #1 reason why someone would end up in an Arizona prison. And I think a lot of people just don't understand that about the criminal justice system. And once their eyes are open to it, they can't help but to be a criminal justice reform advocate. Because we see on TV this like Perry Mason notion of what our courts look like, with a judge on top and a defense counsel and a prosecutor fighting it out below. But as anyone who's ever touched the system knows, the prosecutor has far more power than any of the other players. And what mandatory minimums do is they take that power from the judge, they take that ability or want to go to trial from the defense attorney, and they place it all in the hands of a prosecutor at an incredibly early stage in the criminal justice process. It leads to absurd results in some cases. And it's a system that we should change, and we should return to a time when judges in Arizona, and we have incredibly fine judges in Arizona who are very much invested in their community and want to be able to do justice and can't, because the legislature has taken the power away from them.
Yeah, and speaking of legislator on that, several times I was down at the legislature, and for those who supported mandatory minimums, that was their definition. Hey, these mandatory minimums were meant to be in place for the dealers. But, we were very effective in showing that, you have everybody else being caught up in this. And even for someone who was a dealer, there was a question during one of the sessions, one of the committees, where, we have individuals who have substance disorder, but there was like, what would be the therapy for a dealer? And it's really simple because, I'm working with several individuals and mentoring them now because you have more of a cog skills issue. You want to get people connected to life skills and mentoring, both on the professional and the personal side. And that's just to touch the surface of it. It can play out 1,000 different ways, but just to totally ignore that there might be some issues there, and dealers won't benefit from therapy either. That's just a total hard in trying to justify these mandatory minimums that should be eliminated.
It's like we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas.
Correct. Correct. For decades now. So the next question, as MCAO, which is Maricopa County Attorney, would you support the efforts to allow people with nonviolent, non-dangerous offenses to earn expungements of their records outside of the MCAO diversion program?
Yes. Many people don't realize how bad our system is here in Arizona, that we don't have a true expungement statute. It's only one very, very narrow area of law. And it seems to me that we need to be able to provide folks with a real opportunity to have that second chance, because we know what the collateral consequences of a conviction look like. We know that it makes housing nearly impossible, that it makes the ability to get a job, to get student loans, to get so many other government benefits far too difficult. And it makes that re-entry process, let's be real, really nearly impossible. Early on in my career, one of the things that I did, and I think every prosecutor ought to do this, is go through a re-entry simulation where, okay. Yeah, and I know that we've talked about that. I think that should be mandatory training for a prosecutor, because it's really difficult and it's unfair.
Okay, and Billy, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you. And folks in the chat room, we will get to your questions, I promise. I want to move to the impact of charging decisions. Mm-hmm. And there are traumas, and you just alluded to it, there are traumas that are associated with becoming an inmate, in theory, serving your sentence and your time is done and you're released, but it isn't, because just as you said, there's housing issues, there's job issues, there's all kinds of things. And so it goes on. So, is incarceration the best mode to serve in the interest of justice? And if you look over in the chat room, Holly had asked, do you have any ideas about alternatives to incarceration that we can try and implement or we can advocate for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our criminal justice system should look at incarceration as a last resort for those who would continue to do harm to the community. And I think and it should be paired with actual rehabilitation inside those facilities. Let me tell you for a second how different that is from what we have now. Because one of the things that we do with our system now is we take folks who have substance use issues and disproportionately imprison them without any sort of support or resources. So when I look at the caseload that comes through this office, it seems to me that what this office ought to be focusing on is crimes of violence, crimes that target women, children, our seniors, human trafficking, and public corruption. And that for so many other instances, like low-level nonviolent offenses, we should be looking at whether or not it's in the interest of justice to charge folks at all. I've also applied this in the drug context as well. I was the first person in this race to say in a loud and proud voice that we should stop charging low-level marijuana offenses when we are surrounded by communities that no longer regard cannabis possession as any sort of offense. I think the same holds true with when it comes to other drugs, that we should be looking at treatment always. And let me tell you how different that is from what we have now, because there's a lot of disinformation going on as to what's happening in our diversion programs. As someone who knows a bit about addiction through family and friends, we know that addiction is very rarely a clear path as one is going through treatment. We know that relapse is probable, and it's very rarely like that straight line. Our current diversion program only allows someone to participate once. And it seems to me that that is such a profound misstep, because that's not going to be those folks who need the treatment the most or could benefit from it the most, and is only going to serve to perpetuate our current system, which is going to incarcerate substance use disorder instead of treating it. So do I have alternatives to incarceration? Heck yeah, it's going to be an actual real treatment and offered to a broad range of offenses. And I'm not just talking about drug-related offenses. Drug-motivated crimes and drug-adjacent behavior should also be, concerned. One of my very good friends likes to tell the story of how he ended up in treatment, and it wasn't at all related to being caught with drugs in his possession. It was because after a string of petty thefts, a judge was intelligent enough to realize, hey, listen, this looks like behavior that's motivated by a substance use disorder. Let's do something about it. And it seems to me that a prosecutor who knows what they're looking for and is going to be smarter and more intelligent about substance use issues will be able to affect that real change.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
With the incarceration rate of women sharply rising in Arizona and the women's prison population doubling from 2000 to 2018, and this is something I know something about. I've been teaching at Perryville for a number of years now, and I know those women. And when I post about them, I call them my sisters in orange, and I mean it, because I look at them and I hear their stories, and so many times I just think, there, for the grace of God go I, that 20 years ago I didn't get caught up in something that I shouldn't have. And then I see the effects on their children. I see the effects on their families. I see the desecration of the whole thing. And so I want to know, what are some of the factors that you think in Arizona we have had this expansive increase from 2000 to 2018, which of the statistics that we have?
Yeah, and when we look at those statistics, I can't help but to think of scripture myself. Go and learn the meaning of these words. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. It seems to me that we sacrifice our mothers now to this carceral system. And it is largely driven by substance use issues as well. And we need to be cognizant that the school to prison pipeline, it doesn't start in our schools. It starts with the criminalization of mothers, because the greatest predictor of whether or not a child will end up in our system is whether or not their parents are. So we need to be thinking about those issues. We need to rethink the way this office interacts when it comes to removing children and severing those parental ties for folks who are incarcerated. It's a big issue, and we've been far too regressive for too long. But it seems to me that the kinds of reforms that we're talking about, diverting folks from the system, making sure that we're acting only with the interests of justice in mind, providing real rehabilitation, providing restorative practices, and deflection programs when appropriate, it's going to end up benefiting all of our mamas who are currently serving. And then to add to that, when we talk about good time credit and earned release credits to remedy the harms and wrongs of the past, that's going to be our first step at the legislature.
You know, and you talked about the school to prison pipeline. When I talk about this in groups, I tend to start before that, so school to confinement. Because confinement occurs, I mean, you can look at elementary students, especially in people of color children, and you can see how they're confined, how they're isolated. Isolation in itself is an abusive tactic. And so we have to have change. And it'll only produce such good results if we will just all work together. One of the changes that I would probably be less happy about, to interject my own thoughts on that, if Roe versus Wade were to be reversed by the US Supreme Court in our future, would you prosecute women who have elected to have an abortion?
Absolutely not.
Anything else?
I mean, I have a lot to say on it. I think it's disgusting that Arizona continues to have felony abortion laws on the books. It's not just felony abortion laws, which, by the way, have a mandatory minimum component as well. A mandatory minimum of 2 years for accessing an abortion and a max of 5, a mandatory minimum of 1 year for providing one and a max of 5. There's also the criminalization of contraceptives. But it's a much bigger picture as well, because as we talk about the criminalization of motherhood and the choice whether or not to become a parent, it's also who will be investigated. Because those jurisdictions, and I'm talking now internationally, that have gone down this path of criminalizing abortion, start to investigate women who have had miscarriages and start to asking those questions about whether or not, you know, they were induced, what the person was eating at the time, interviewing their doctors, interjecting themselves in the most just fundamentally private portions of someone's life. And it seems to me that that is a place that Arizona doesn't want to go, and that our Maricopa County Attorney absolutely ought not to go. And I stand resolute in the fact that it will never be in the interest of justice for our county attorney to pursue those cases, ever.
From my own ignorance and naivete, if it's the law, how do you avoid it?
Sure, I think that's a really good question. So the way a prosecutor's office works is with this idea of prosecutorial discretion. This office is elected for a reason, and it's elected so that the constituents in the community can know what someone's priorities are. Because your prosecutor has an awful lot of power to choose to charge, to choose not to charge, and to make recommendations with respect to sentencing. It is not and will never be a situation where your prosecutor has to act robotically and enforce every nuance of every law. I mean, think about it for just one hot second with the laws that we don't enforce. We have 1,500 felonies on the books. We only ever charge about 1,000 of them. And we still have felonies like adultery, for example. We don't see a county attorney aggressively pursuing those sorts of charges. And why not? Because it's not in the interest of justice. We need to be looking to, when we talk about crime in general, the harm to the community, the ability to provide true rehabilitation, and the cost to the taxpayers for providing all of this justice. And that's what a good prosecutor should do. So no, prosecutorial discretion is always to look to those concerns first in making any charging decision. And there is no mandate under law that every person is charged for every offense every time, nor would we want it that way.
Thank you for that clarification. I'm going to go back to Holly in the chat to her second question, but it actually mirrors a question that I had added earlier. This morning, I read that our state Supreme Court has ruled that judges can put juveniles in prison for life. Now, you know I've read study after study. The brain is not fully developed. You know, they don't have the complete rationale, ability. It's not fully developed in terms of their thought processes. And so 2 questions. Number one, going to Holly, she asked, what is your approach to juvenile justice? And then from both of us, what are your thoughts about this ruling that you could put a juvenile in prison for life?
This just is really hard. You know, I'm someone who has spent an awful lot of time in the juvenile detention centers. I taught in the street law program. I saw what I'm convinced are the best minds of the next generation locked up. And it's absolutely heartbreaking, and we have got to do better. Let me tell you how I come to any conclusion that I do. As someone who has a background in science, I look to truth, I look to best evidence. And we know that when it comes to juvenile justice, the ground has shifted considerably, even in the last 10 years, about what we know about the juvenile brain. We know that the thinking hasn't changed significantly at the county attorney's office. In fact, we know that they spent thousands of taxpayer dollars commissioning studies that show the opposite, that try to show that someone's brain is somehow fixed and developed before the age of 18. And I find that to be disgusting and shameful and anti-science. So when I look at these issues, I'm informed by the idea that we know all persons' capacity for change, but when it comes to juveniles in particular, that juveniles are still developing up till the age of 25. It's one of the reasons why I've been a big proponent of the Raise the Age legislation. I am also committed that in those areas where your county attorney has discretion, and there's different statutes affecting when someone who is a juvenile is charged as an adult, but in those areas where the county attorney has the discretion to not be charging juveniles under those statutes, and asking to keep them in the juvenile system where they can receive some modicum of rehabilitation. We still need to work hard there too, because the opportunities that we have in our juvenile system are simply not enough. When it comes to sentences like recommending life or de facto life, I wholeheartedly disagree. And I think that our county attorney ought to have a policy on day one to not make any such recommendations ever. I know that there's also a fair amount of juveniles who are caught up in the Miller-Montgomery issues of when those life without parole were granted to juveniles. And for those who are still working toward a resolution, I would be in favor of resentencing and advocating for resentencing for all of those folks.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. You mentioned that you have been in juvenile facilities and you have met with juveniles and you know them. Are you open to meeting with inmates that are currently serving time and listening to their stories? And what kind of influence would that have on you?
I mean, absolutely. They've been writing me throughout this entire campaign. They've been informing a lot of these decisions. Of course, I'm open to meeting with directly impacted individuals and their families. When we talk about what it means to serve the entire community, they are part of that community, and we need to be listening.
And who do you see as, should you be elected to office, who do you see as your allied partners? Who are the people that your work, you would see to it that there's going to be intersection of your work and theirs for the betterment of the human dignity factor?
Oh my goodness. Well, I hope it will be folks in the Arizona Faith Network. I've built a broad coalition that's supporting me now, and maybe that's the first place to start is, you know, we've built relationships with the LGBTQ community and are the Equality Arizona endorsed candidate. I've built relationships with the legislature because we need those sorts of pathways in order to get things done. So folks like Charlene Fernandez and Rich Bolding and Diego Rodriguez and Tony Navarrete and Martin Quezada and so many of those leaders who've been working so hard on these issues for so many years. I built relationships with labor because I think it's really important to recognize the dignity of work, and folks like AFSCME and Southwest Carpenters have been close allies because they see how this office has failed to recognize the dignity of work and go after those folks who would exploit our workers. I've built relationships with other community organizations and I'm in conversation with folks like Mass Liberation and Lucha because I think they bring a valued voice and pathway to communicating with those who have the most interaction with our criminal justice system and are in need of justice the most. But for those who I didn't list, I want to say that this door will always be open, because when I think of what it means to serve the public means everyone, and it means being able to listen, to take those good ideas and to implement them.
Okay. 3 character traits that are necessary for this office.
Got to be tough, smart, and fair.
That was quick.
It's the campaign tagline, I've got to tell you.
Right.
No, that's what everybody wants out of their prosecutors. You know what? You have to have a firm line, and you have to be willing to make those tough calls. We've had people in this office who haven't been particularly smart with our resources, and that's been a big part of this campaign. And then last, restoring fairness and equal justice under the law is our top priority.
All right, I want to circle back up to, there was a question from Juan. He said, if elected, how will you help promote the fairness of every defendant receiving due process rights and holding those who deviate from that due process accountable?
Right, good question, because that's not necessarily happening right now. One of the things that I'm very concerned with is justice during COVID, and the fact that we haven't seen a plan out of this office to deal with the backlog, which means about 5,500 folks who have been either arrested or cited for an offense. They know that their case is pending and it's just hanging out there, sometimes with a statute of limitations up to 7 years. And these people are being held in limbo, and I view that as a real due process concern. How do you propose to move forward with your life, whether you want to move away from Arizona, or you want to start a family, or you want to just move forward and not have any direction from our county attorney as to what's going to happen to you in the near future, when and if you ever get charged? So one of my first priorities as county attorney will be to build out timelines so that folks know what to expect, because it is profoundly unfair to leave people in this level of legal limbo. Those who violate due process accountable is a much tougher question. I mean, we've talked about the elimination of qualified immunity. We've talked about transparency. I think the one thing that we really haven't talked about is how to hold your own prosecutors accountable inside this office, because that's not something we've really seen much of in the past, even with people we know have been violating either due process rights or even rights to a respectful workplace. It has been, in some cases, months, in many cases, decades of this unaccountable behavior and bad behavior that's been tolerated. And it seems to me that being able to provide that sort of, top-down leadership and culture change is going to be absolutely key. I think having a conviction integrity unit that actually stands for integrity will be key as well. Right now, it's a single person, and when there are issues like we're talking about of failures of due process, failures of prosecutorial misconduct, issues of police use of force, they're just referred back to the person to investigate them. And that's not a process that we can be proud of either. So building out the conviction integrity unit and doing it in a way that is community involved is, again, a day one priority and will help hold all of us accountable.
Thank you. Khalil, do you have any further questions?
So I want to just go back to conviction integrity and looking at the conviction integrity that's established. How do you plan to empower? Because if you're elected, how do you plan to empower this conviction integrity unit?
Sorry, the sun is in my eyes. It's oh, that's much better. I'm not being blinded. Yeah, how do I plan to empower the conviction integrity unit? Good question. So let me talk real quick about the way the unit works right now, because that's part of the problem in my view. The problem is that it's one person. The problem is that it appears to be a catch-all for all of these different cases where there's been failures in the process, whether it comes from the prosecutor side, whether it comes from police use of force side, or whether it's a instance of a conviction that needs that second review. So coming from a place of best evidence and science, I I've stolen, let's be real. I've stolen from those jurisdictions who have got it right, what that model needs to look like. It needs to look like a group of prosecutors, at least one who has had significant defense and civil rights work under their belt. It means that we actually involve the community in making those decisions and have that working shareholders board that is truly representative. And it means that this office works side by side with clemency. It works with post-conviction relief efforts, and then it has real tracking metrics included. Right now, you can make a referral to this unit and do so orally. And as such, the public will never know about it because you can't, through a public records request, ask for something that is orally delivered. And we need to be able to make sure that we have receipts on everything that's referred to this unit, and then be able to show the public that action was actually taken, not just that we've established a unit that's not necessarily doing anything.
Okay. And just one last question for me. Do you support compensation? So where we're talking about the conviction integrity, wrongful convictions, Arizona is a state of, I think about 17 now, if I remember right, where there's no compensation laws on the books. Other states, for those where there's wrongful convictions and people who are incarcerated for decades at a time, they have compensation laws. Do you support compensation legislation?
Yes.
All right, Billy.
I'm going to be an ally down at the Capitol on this issue too. This is something that needs to be addressed.
Okay. All right. Anything else, Billy? Any closing or any other questions we have in the chat box?
We're good on the chat box. And Julie, in terms of next steps for anybody, what would you recommend?
Vote. We've got an election coming up in 3 weeks from now. It's really important that your voice is heard. If you have other lingering questions, I'm not hard to find. Come join me on Facebook, at me on Twitter. I'm Julie Gunnigle. My website is gunnigle2020.com. I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you might have. But the primary way we hold those in power accountable in a democracy is through the democratic process and is through voting. And I would be pleased, proud, and honored to have your support and have your vote. If you've been particularly inspired by what I've had to say today, we need folks to help get the word out, and Gunnigle2020.com is the place if you're inclined to volunteer, or if you have some extra dough hanging around and want to help get out the message. Also a great place to donate. But I'm really proud and pleased to have had this conversation. And I hope this is the start of many, many more once we get to November 3rd.
We thank you so much for your time. I want to thank David Topic and Khalil Rushdan. And with that, we close. Best wishes.
Right back at you.
Thank you.
Thank you.